making policy. They're part of a corrupted process because basically it's a career-driven process in which each of the people is driven by an individualistic impulse to enhance their career and to move their own personal career forward. And while I agree everybody has the right to think about these things and to have that be part of their reckoning as to what should motivate them and what drives them to do what they do, on the other hand, if there's too much of that, if there's too much careerism, I think which is basically one of the ills of the world, then essentially a lot of really important goods are left off the table. Careerism taken to an extreme is really unhealthy for society. And unfortunately, in our leadership structure, we often have too much of that. However, at the same time, we also have to get people who are deep thinkers on these subjects to be willing to stick their heads up above the parapets, as it were, and lay their lives on the line for the sake of the health of the planet and all of their brothers and sisters. We've got to get some people who have real courage to sort of stand up and be willing to, hey, what I always say is to be willing to fall on their swords if necessary in order to get this ball rolling. It's not necessarily going to be all cake and dessert on the way to the changes that we need to make. There's going to be a lot of tough sledding, and it's going to take a lot of courageous people to be willing to stand up and get beyond the corrupt process of sound bites and the lowest common denominator and move towards some real consciousness raising, some real elevation of the knowledge and understanding of the body politic. There's got to be a real concerted effort made to get hundreds of millions and billions of people involved in demanding that these changes be made. Because if that doesn't happen, then the changes will not be made. We've got to get hundreds of millions of people educated to new ways of thinking and get them to demand that our leadership move in those directions. And I think, I'm 63 years old. I came up in a time, at least in the United States, where there was a lot of idealism and a lot of communitarian impulses and so forth. And I think over time, a lot of that in my life got lost. And at least in the United States, we moved towards a much more self-centered, self-oriented society and away from kind of like the ideals of somebody like John F. Kennedy, who said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And of course, that's not the only thing a person has to do in their life, because sometimes you do have to just do for yourself, and you do have to take care of your kids, you got to take care of your family, you got to take care of your parents, you got to take care of whatever else there is that you're personally involved in. But there is also a bigger mission that we're all involved in, and we ignore that bigger mission at our peril.
Yes, it's basically now it's nearly world service to get our civilization up to speed to, one, recognise what the problem is and then take action. And, of course, taking action, it's just to get the message across. Oh, boy.
Well, if you break this thing down into a lot of different parts, it's a lot easier to sort of come up with solutions. I mean, sometimes you look at the world and you just look at the news every day and it just sort of seems so overwhelming and so depressing that there are so many problems happening all at once and in so many places to so many people. It's enough to take the heart out of many people, But the fact is that the way that you solve problems is one by one. You can't allow the overwhelming nature that is being delivered to us through modern communications stop you from looking at the problems individually, and especially the ones that are closest to home. So, for example, I've really thought a lot about why is it so difficult for us to reuse materials? What stands in the way? Well, there are a lot of really simple little things that stand in the way. For example, let's say you want to recycle a glass bottle, but the glass bottle has a label glued onto it with a kind of adhesive which is so robust that in order to get the adhesive off of the glass, that the glass has to be dipped in this really caustic chemical. Things like that have to be changed. They have to say, no, you can't do it that way. if you're going to make disposable products, the products have to be made to be easily recyclable. The materials have to be easily reconstituted and easily returned to virgin material status. You can't pollute them by sort of like creating these stubborn, undegradable products that are composites of all different kinds of chemistries and materials. Then once you start thinking about that, you could come up with all kinds of approaches to actually how you could accomplish what you could say to manufacturers that they're required to do in order to meet these standards. In other words, you have to set up a new set of standards on what the manufacturers are allowed to do. You don't want to put them out of business. You don't want to tell them they can't make containers. You just want to tell them that they need to make containers that are not going to force us to keep churning up the earth and throwing it away. It's really not that difficult. But the problem is that our educational institutions are just starting to be responsive to training people to think about these things and how to solve these problems. So we're just really at the very cusp in environmental sciences and other environmental technologies to where we're facing up to how do we deal with these problems. And that's another thing that basically the citizens have to really insist to their leadership, is that they want this kind of effort of educating upcoming generations on how to solve these problems. They want public resources put there so that basically the new generation is going to have the tools that they need to prevent what's going on now from continuing. So basically, I guess to make a long story short, what I'm saying is if you take the problems one by one and you look at what the problems are and you look at what the foundations of the problems are and why they actually have gotten to be the way they are and what would have to change in order to make it different, they aren't really all that intractable on that basis. They're only intractable when you sort of like see so many big problems at once and yet don't really have any idea of the detailed underpinnings that make it that way. But we can do that. People are very clever. And I think that we're survivors, too. So I think that basically, one way or another, we're going to get there. It's just a question of how much suffering is going to happen before we get there. So I'm actually really optimistic that this big ship that we're on, that's been moving in a kind of self-destructive direction, will be turned around and that we will find our way to a more durable prosperity. Just because human beings are actually survivors.
Yes, Jonathan.
I just hope that as many of us as possible survive instead of sort of like having to sort of like depopulate half the planet before people are ready to take action.
You sent me a piece there, How to Clean Up a River, and I feel it's superb. Can you go right through that one and allow people to realise just how a river can affect a huge catchment area of both people and biota?
Yeah, well, it's like as I was thinking about the problems of remediation, which means how do you fix what's been broken? I started thinking about my own experience, and I grew up in this really beautiful river valley in the New England part of the United States. And in the 19th century, this river that ran through the town that I lived in, right close to where I lived, a huge, beautiful river, tidal river, had been completely polluted because they had built these leather and shoe mills all along the river that were powered by water power from the river. And basically over a period of 50 to 75 years, they were just dumping so much industrial waste into the river that it essentially totally killed the river. I mean, there was really nothing that could live in the river. As a matter of fact, you could actually go down to the river and you could, if you threw a lit torch in the river would actually start on fire. And there was so much solvents and other materials in the river. And that was when I was a little boy when we first moved to that area. And then people kind of like got fed up and they said, we're just not going to do this anymore. We got to clean this river up. And so basically a commitment was made kind of like in concert with all the communities along the river, which extend from the ocean probably at least like 100 miles inland. And so basically all the communities kind of like banded together and said, we're going to clean up this river. And they made a concerted effort to do so by stopping these dirty industries from dumping their waste in the water. And any industries that couldn't survive without dumping their wastes, they were just outlawed. and the other companies who could survive but just needed some assistance in trying to figure out how to deal with their wastes in a non-polluting way, those companies were given assistance, and so that they could survive. But in the end, actually, very few of those early industrial companies survived, and kind of like more modern industries sprung up along that river, many of them knowledge industries and industries that don't really make any pollution at all. So after about 20 years from the time that they started doing this, there was, again, recreation in the river. There was recreational fishing, swimming, boating. The river was essentially clean. Of course, this is a river which was scoured regularly by tidal forces, so it had a lot of self-cleaning action, but just by stopping all of the human activities that were causing the river to die, that's, in the end, what made it be able to come back to life. I mean, this planet is actually very resilient unless you get things to the point where everything all at once is just like under attack and all life forms at once are under threat. And we aren't far from that now. Unfortunately, if we don't really make the decision to make these kind of dramatic efforts to turn this around, then we're going to be facing a kind of environmental collapse which will result to severe impacts on the human race as well as every other life form on Earth. And my guess is that's probably not more than 25 or 30 years off. And for many people, it's happening right now. So we got to get the show on the road. There's really just no choice, but it's not like we don't have examples from around the world of people who have made the decision to change these things and have successful examples to show us. So I think we've got to go look for those, dig those things out. We've got to spread the word around about how the success stories work and, what kind of efforts and what kind of focus was required, what kind of changes in our regulatory structures or what kind of changes in our attitudes or culture were required in order to make these changes effective. And we've got to spread that word around the whole planet in order to get to this change that we need to happen.
Very true, Jonathan. I'm speaking with Jonathan Cole from the big island of Hawaii. Jonathan is an ecological and technical visionary looking at how we can ignite people's consciousness to make the change. Jonathan, solar energy is known as sunrise energy, whereas in many ways coal and oil and gas is seen as a sunset industry. Now, you have mentioned that Germany is one of the leading solar energy countries on Earth, and it is closer to the North Pole than New Zealand is to the South Pole. So theoretically, we should be able to put in place both solar hot water and solar voltaics in this country, and therefore we don't need to dam one more river, because New Zealand's got a huge percentage of its energy coming from dams, and yet also these rivers are great arteries for Mother Earth, and it stops fish from moving up and down and a lot of other aquatic life. Can you give an appraisal of solar energy to get the ball rolling?
Sure. More solar energy falls on the planet than in one day than the planet would require in 1 year to meet all of its energy needs, including electrical needs for home and industry and also transportation, electrical to power. If all the cars in the world were electric vehicles, there's more than enough energy coming from the sun to power all of them. If we just used less than 1/100th of 1% of the surface of the Earth to collect solar energy and convert it into useful forms. It's kind of amazing, and one of the reasons it's so difficult for people to realize why this is they say, yeah, but look at me, I live in north of Auckland, it's always cloudy, for example. Well, folks, I live in a place in Hawaii which is cloudy at least 50 to 60% of the time, and I live completely on solar energy. I don't use any other energy besides the solar. And how is that possible? What happens when the clouds come? Well, when the clouds come, the solar electric photovoltaic panels, they still generate electricity. They just generate less electricity than they would in full sun. So if there's some level of solar panels that you can have that will generate your needs even if it were dark, cloudy weather all the time. So basically, these are the things that I've been working on figuring out for the last 30 years and actually have figured out that really there's no reason why we need to we can have our cake and eat it too, as it were, because I have all the amenities. I have washer and dryer and